What's Up with Jimmy? A story of trauma and friendship, written and illustrated by Chet Kennedy. After a terrible forest fire, 4 friends find themselves together again. They are shocked and relieved and go back to laughing and playing like before. Although they notice that Jimmy is a bit different. Something has changed. He still looks the same, he still talks the same, he still tells the same jokes, but he seems a bit more on edge. The 4 friends notice that he scares more easily. He jumps at loud noises and will often freeze right where he is like a statue. Sometimes he can be moody or quick-tempered. They were very confused because Jimmy's not like this. But the one thing they noticed is Jimmy doesn't talk about the fire. When the 4 friends are playing, sometimes they are reminded of the fire. They can come across fallen trees or burnt logs. Sometimes they see animals who were hurt by the fire. When that happens, they like to talk about what they saw in the fire, but Jimmy doesn't. When they start talking about the fire, Jimmy goes silent. He looks down, disengages, and sometimes looks very scared. Sometimes he will even cry. That's not the worst of it though. Sometimes the forest smells like fire. Sometimes the smell of burning trees or leaves or the scent of fur burning wafts toward the 3 friends. And when that happens, Jimmy starts to scream uncontrollably and runs off to find a place to hide. After that happened a few times, the 3 friends began to ask themselves, what's going on with Jimmy? One of Jimmy's friends decided that maybe he was stressed, so they tried to soothe him. They made him a bubble bath, they played soft music, and taught him to do breathing exercises. But every time that smell came through the air, Jimmy would still get scared. Then, another of Jimmy's friends wondered if maybe Jimmy was not strong enough and that all this behavior was a lack of resilience or an absence of grit. In his mind, Jimmy was not living up to his full potential. He explained to Jimmy that the forest fire was supposed to be his wake-up call and reminded him that what didn't kill him was supposed to make him stronger. They set little fires for Jimmy to put out. They rubbed ashes on his clothes so he could get used to the smell. They told him they were building up his character, but Jimmy felt weaker and weaker and got worse and worse. Then Jimmy ran off to his hiding spot again. It began to be very clear that there was something seriously different about Jimmy. It was around this time that Carl, the wise old Canada goose, stopped in to chat with the 3 friends. He had been watching their antics and had been paying particular attention to Jimmy. He asked for some clarity, and the 3 friends broke into a fierce discussion on all of the things they had been noticing about their friend. They had noticed a clear difference between Jimmy before and after the fire. They noticed that he had a distinct reaction to smells and reminders of the fire. They even talked about his moodiness, his detachment, and his tendency to run and hide. Carl listened intently to their thoughts and explanations. Finally, the 3 friends summed up their discussion with, "We just think he's stressed about the fire, and he should get over it already. We're tired of whatever is going on with Jimmy." Carl then explained, Jimmy is not stressed. Jimmy has been traumatized. When the fire happened, many of the animals in the forest were able to find secure places to hide and wait until things were safe. Then they all happily went back to the forest and continued to live as normal. Most of them didn't lose homes or food or regular swimming spots, so the fire didn't change much for them at all. Jimmy, on the other hand, had been trapped by the fire. He was too far in the forest and couldn't find his way out to safety. Jimmy then hid under a large boulder and waited as the whole forest burned down around him. In Jimmy's heart, he believed that he had lost everything. Carl explained, that night was so scary, so terrifying for Jimmy that he believed he was going to die. Not just die, that he would be annihilated. The fear crept down into his soul and is lodged there within his body, and Jimmy is now trapped within a recurring nightmare of that fire. Trauma is what is up with Jimmy. The 3 friends sat in shocked silence, and they felt terrible for the things that they had said and did and felt about Jimmy. They knew that they had not been good friends. In a desire to help their friend, they asked Carl, "What is trauma?" "Trauma," Carl explained, at its core is suffering that doesn't go away. Some have explained that trauma is an event in the past that doesn't stay there. Because of its recurring nature, those who are suffering from trauma find that they lose connection to systems of attachment and meaning in their community. Carl pointed at the three friends. This is why Jimmy is having a hard time being a good friend lately. Carl then retrieved a book from his backpack and began to show the small furry friends how Jimmy's traumatic event was causing him to experience hyperarousal, intrusion, and constriction. He then stated in a British accent, which, according to Judith Herman, are symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. "When will Jimmy get over it?" asked the biggest furry friend. Carl leaned far, far over, so that he could look his young inquisitor in the eye. With a voice of compassion and grace, he said, "He won't get over it. That's not how trauma works. Time will not heal this wound. It will only make it worse." Carl thought for a moment. He picked up a small branch and began to shape it into a ring. "One day," he said, "a cousin of mine found himself caught in a six-pack ring. It looped around his neck and his wing. It prevented him from flying." Carl then made a haphazard attempt at walking around with his wing strapped to his head. This made the small furry friends laugh. "Kind of like trauma," Carl continued. "No one wanted to acknowledge that there was anything wrong. They all went along like he was fine." Carl looked down at the ground, like he felt sorry for something he had done or not done for his cousin. When it came time to fly south, we all realized that time had not healed the problem my cousin had found himself in. He needed more than just thoughts and prayers. We needed to help him get untangled from this mess. "How do we help Jimmy get untangled?" one of the friends asked. "Jimmy needs to be heard, to be believed, and to be loved," said Carl. "As a bird, I fly all over the world bearing witness to all that the Creator has made. There is much good in the world, but there is also much that is terrible and cruel and horrible. I see all of it. Jimmy got trapped in the forest in a time of unspeakable terror. Now that terror will not let him go." Carl then looked at the three friends. If we are patient and loving and kind and compassionate and become the very best listeners we can help our friend Jimmy. We must be strong hearts for him while he finds his way out of the burning forest. Over time, Jimmy's friends noticed that sometimes Jimmy would go off alone with Carl to talk about what happened. These journeys with Carl seemed to be good for Jimmy because he was no longer silent about what had happened during the forest fire. At first, if they are honest, Jimmy's recollection of the night of the fire was really convoluted and kind of confusing. When they asked Carl about it, he told them Jimmy's story is messy because it is unintegrated. It's currently a mishmash because it's stored in different parts of his experience. At this statement, the three friends looked at each other in confusion, then looked back at Carl. Carl took a large leaf from the ground and tore it into 4 pieces. He gave one to each of the friends. Jimmy's forest fire experience is broken and messy because some of it might be stored in his emotions, some of it might be stored in his mind, some of it might be stored in his body, and some of it might be stored back at the site of his trauma. It's quite a journey to piece it all together and make it all make sense. First for Jimmy, then for us. "How should we respond to this?" asked one of the small friends. "I hear you, I believe you, I love you," said Carl, "and you have to mean it with all of your heart." Over the next few years, Jimmy and Carl went on many walks. Carl also found some other animals who had been traumatized by the fire and invited Jimmy to walk and talk with them too. As they walked and talked and shared stories, they carried each other's experiences along. Sometimes the weight of the shame, fear, and humiliation seemed too much to bear, but they all held space for each other in the journey. Then one day, Jimmy invited his friends along. Jimmy told them about his experience with the fire. He explained how he had been scared and thought he would die. He also explained how he had felt humiliated about getting trapped and not being able to get out. He then went on to clarify that for a long time he felt shame for somehow surviving the fire when other animals didn't. He also had felt shame because he didn't bounce back like the others had. He believed it was somehow a mark on his character. He then explained how his walks with Carl and the other animals helped him to piece together his own experience and find healing. Although they did not all share the same trauma, his friends realized that their hurts they didn't know they had, began to heal while caring for Jimmy and the others. When Carl finally flew south again, Jimmy and his friends were back to laughing and jumping and playing in the forest. Often they would find other animals like Jimmy, whose hearts were hurt and whose wounds were deep. When they heard the traumatic stories from others, they responded, "We hear you, we believe you, we love you." Jimmy had become someone like Carl, who could walk alongside others and hear them tell their stories. He had also become connected enough in the forest that he could help them find other animals who were on the journey towards healing like Jimmy had been. And even now, sometimes, Jimmy catches a scent of fire in the woods and his heart freezes. His eyes open wide and his mind fills with death. Even though he is feeling good and seems great, and to everyone else he seems strong and healed. Even though he has walked others through their experiences and held their shame and humiliations when they were too heavy to carry. Even though he has saved so many other creatures from their living nightmares, sometimes his lingers on. And when this happens, his three friends, Carl the Canada goose, and all the animals they had met on their journey towards healing, gather around him and say, "We hear you, we believe you, we love you." And Jimmy sleeps better most nights.